Anyway, her legacy, she was realizing, wasn't what she inherited. It was what she missed. Marjorie watched the stars blink above the lake, no sound but crickets, the water's hush, and Beverly's light breathing nearby. She thought of Walter, his laugh, his steadiness, the way he used to say, "Character isn't what you say at the mic, it's what you whisper to yourself at midnight." She closed her eyes, whispered back, "Thank you for the silence. It told me exactly who I am." The living room, once framed by bookshelves and soft pillows, was now overtaken by Mia's yoga setup, foam rollers, ring lights, a small Bluetooth speaker that spat out synthetic forest sounds every morning at 7:12 a.m. Carolyn's recliner had been pushed against the far wall and covered with a beige throw that didn't quite hide the disrespect. She didn't argue, just took her crossword to the porch instead. Jason had grown quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. A tension that lived in the corners of his mouth, the shrug of his shoulders whenever she asked if he needed anything. It wasn't neglect, it was detachment, the kind that used to only show up in strangers' eyes. "Jason," she offered one evening after catching him alone in the kitchen, "I can pitch in for the utilities if the budget's tight. Just let me know." He didn't look up from the sink. "We've got it," he said, cold, clipped. Carolyn nodded, left the conversation right where it fell. Later that night, she opened the hallway closet and pulled out a stack of flattened boxes from when she'd first moved in. She carried them to her room in silence, folded them together, and began to fill them. Slowly, discreetly. A few shawls, her spare tea set, a row of books she'd already read. She labeled the first box in clean capital letters, "Donation." That same night, she found herself staring at the antique wall mirror above her dresser. Her reflection was sharp, shoulders still squared, eyes calm. Her silver hair was pinned neatly. Nothing about her looked like someone who didn't belong. She reached for the phone. "Irene Hayes," the voice answered on the second ring. Familiar, crisp, a lawyer who'd once helped draft her living trust and the original deed after Richard's death. "I'm thinking," Carolyn said, "about changing the deed." There was a pause. Then Irene's voice softened without losing its steel. "Still, you're right." Carolyn closed her eyes, exhaled. "Good," she said. "Then let's not waste time." The next morning, Mia flounced in wearing oversized sunglasses and clogs. "You didn't see my phone, did you?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "I swear this place is a black hole for anything modern." Carolyn said nothing, just stirred her tea. Mia rolled her eyes and breezed back out. Carolyn didn't move. She just let the silence return, let it settle around her shoulders like armor. In her lap was the manila envelope she hadn't opened yet, couriered from Irene's office that morning. Inside, the preliminary forms for restructuring ownership. Carolyn traced the seal with her thumb but didn't break it. Not yet. Let the house stay calm for one more day. Let them think the ice was just frost. Before they realized, it was permanent. Carolyn noticed the first frame missing on a Tuesday. It was the photo of her and Richard on the Outer Banks, wind-blown, grinning, cheeks sun-flushed from a day of bad fishing and too much salt air. For a second, she thought maybe it had fallen, but the nail was still there, bare and empty. In its place, by Friday, hung an abstract canvas the color of bone. She walked down the hall in silence. The family gallery wall, once a patchwork of graduations, holidays, Jason's first toothless grin, was now a sterile collection of minimalist black and whites, geometric lines, one-word phrases in muted gray, breathe, flow, evolve. Carolyn didn't say anything. She just counted the missing memories. 8 frames. Gone. She found her knitting basket stacked on top of a box labeled Holiday Lights in the garage, the yarn now slightly musty, a pair of needles poking out like forgotten bones. "For space," Mia had written on the masking tape label. That night, Carolyn waited until Jason came home alone. He dropped his keys in the bowl like always, loosened his tie, and reached for the fridge. She didn't rise from her chair. Just said, "Was there a reason my pictures are gone?" Jason blinked. "What?" "The gallery wall, and the knitting supplies in the garage. I'm curious if there was a conversation I missed." He leaned against the counter, sighed. It's not personal, Mom. We're just trying to keep the place balanced, minimal, for our sanity. She stared at him for a long time. You mean for Mia's aesthetic? Jason looked down. It's not just her. Then it's not just a phase. He opened his mouth, then closed it, walked out of the kitchen without another word. The next morning, Mia caught her looking at senior apartments online. Oh, you're looking at Willowview? She asked brightly. Good light. Private units. You'd have your own view. Carolyn clicked through a few listings. Neutral tone, warm features, communal dining. She nodded. Seems peaceful. Mia sipped her smoothie. Plus, you wouldn't have to deal with our chaos. There was no sarcasm in her tone, just clarity, as if she believed it would be a relief for all involved. Carolyn smiled. Exactly. She didn't mention she was calling for research, not for herself. She made 4 calls that afternoon, asked polite questions about wait lists and security deposits. She wrote nothing down. She was testing the waters to see how far others assumed she was willing to go. By the time Irene called back, Carolyn was watering the rose bushes along the side yard. I reviewed the partial rights clause, Irene said. If you buy out their stake, full restructuring is legal. No consent needed. They signed away that leverage when they accepted co-occupant status instead of joint ownership. Carolyn felt the sun warm her forearms. The hose dripped slightly at her feet. And if I do it quietly? It's still clean, just precise. Carolyn nodded. Good. Irene hesitated. Carolyn, this will change things. Once it's filed, I'm not taking the house from them, Carolyn said evenly. I'm just taking the illusion. She ended the call and walked back inside. The hallway was quiet. The gallery wall stared back at her, blank and pristine. She ran her fingers along the nail where her wedding photo used to be, then reached into the console drawer and pulled out the original, still in its silver frame. She rehung it. Dead center. Crooked on purpose. Later that night, while Jason and Mia watched a muted documentary about decluttering, Carolyn pulled out a second notepad. At the top, she wrote, Phase 2, detach without notice. Below it, 1 bullet point. Let them feel the silence before it echoes. She folded the page once, tucked it under her pillow, then turned out the light, smiling in the dark. Carolyn noticed it first with the mug, the blue ceramic one, speckled with little flecks of gold, the one she used each morning since her husband's passing. It wasn't in the cabinet, nor in the dishwasher. She checked the side shelf near the coffee maker, then the drying rack by the sink. Nothing. When she asked Mia casually if she'd seen it, Mia gave a distracted shrug. Oh, that chipped one? I think I tossed it. It looked kind of old. Carolyn didn't respond. She just nodded once, slowly, and walked back to her room. She didn't mention that it had been a handmade anniversary gift from a local potter, that it was one of the few things Richard had chosen himself. She simply wrote the date down in her notepad and underlined it. Twice. Over the next week, it continued. Her scarves vanished from the coat hook, her small collection of wind chimes once hanging on the back porch, replaced with modern steel orbs that didn't make a sound in the breeze. A stack of books she'd been reading disappeared from the side table. Later, she found them boxed and labeled in Sharpie. Garage, seasonal decor. Carolyn brought it up to Jason gently, not accusatorily. Have you noticed some of my things being packed away? Jason, sitting on the couch scrolling his phone, barely looked up. Mia's been decluttering, just trying to make the space easier for everyone. You know how she gets when she's on a roll. Easier for everyone, Carolyn repeated, letting the phrase sit in the air between them. Jason adjusted his posture and added, It's not personal, Mom. We're just trying to create a healthier flow in the home. There was that word again. Flow. As if the house were a river and she had become driftwood. Mia's friends came over that Saturday afternoon. They brought pressed juices and expensive dogs with Instagram accounts. One of them, a woman in lemon-colored linen and wedge sandals, pointed to Carolyn's armchair and asked, Mind if I sit here? Before settling in without waiting for permission. She's so adorable, another one whispered, laughing, as Carolyn brought out a plate of crackers and cheese and set it on the counter. Carolyn stood a little straighter and replied with the kind of smile she'd learned to perfect during years of PTA meetings and condolence calls. A smile that said, "I am here, but I am not yours." Later that evening, while Jason and Mia were out, the doorbell rang. A courier handed her a flat envelope, legal-sized, discreetly stamped. She opened it at the kitchen table with deliberate care. Inside was a crisp summary of the property restructuring documents from Irene Hayes' office. Carolyn read every line, slowly, twice. It outlined exactly what she already knew. With a simple buyout, their partial rights could be dissolved. The power could be returned fully and permanently to her name alone. No permission required, no discussion needed, just execution. She didn't sign anything that night. Instead, she tucked the document back inside and placed it in the center drawer of her desk, the one they never touched. By Sunday morning, she began sorting her valuables, not angrily, not in panic, but with quiet deliberation. Her late husband's watch, the silver comb her grandmother gave her at 16, letters from Jason when he was in college, written in neat block handwriting before his tone turned managerial. Each item went into its own padded box. She labeled the cartons by hand, to keep, storage only. No one saw her carry the first few boxes into the trunk of her car. She waited until the house was empty, music still echoing faintly from Mia's Bluetooth speaker, and drove to a climate-controlled unit just outside downtown. The clerk at the counter didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. The following Wednesday, Carolyn sat on the porch and made a call. "Is the Blue Hemlock cabin still available?" she asked, her voice steady. 3-week trial stay, correct? The woman on the line confirmed. That's right. Carolyn gave her name and credit card number. She picked the start date for 2 weeks later. That would give her enough time to finish what needed doing, and for the silence in the house to reach the point where it was no longer accidental, but intentional. As she hung up, she glanced at the living room window. Inside, Mia danced in front of her phone, rehearsing a yoga routine for the internet. Carolyn watched her through the glass for a moment, then she turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the hills of Asheville rolled into mist and pine. She smiled, not out of happiness, but clarity. Her stay here had been temporary all along. Now it was just becoming official. The cabin sat on a gentle ridge, half hidden behind a curtain of pine and rhododendron. Its wood was dark, weathered, and comforting, the kind of place that didn't pretend to be anything other than quiet. The porch faced east, catching sunrise light that filtered like amber through the branches. Carolyn exhaled as she stepped inside, the screen door clicking softly behind her. No yoga mats, no ring lights, no synthetic forest sounds, just the creak of real wood underfoot and the low hum of wind sliding past old window panes. The living room smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. A handmade quilt folded neatly at the edge of a worn leather armchair. A basket of logs beside the stove. She placed her suitcase down and stood still, letting her body absorb the stillness. The kind of stillness that wasn't absence, but presence. She felt, for the first time in months, like the air didn't press back. The first morning, she rose early and made coffee on the old stovetop percolator, the way she used to before everything became programmable. She took her mug to the small writing desk near the window, opened her notebook, and wrote only 3 words: clean, not cruel. It was the phrase that had been circling her mind like a hawk for weeks, when Mia had tossed her keepsakes like clutter, when Jason had swallowed his spine and called it compromise. Carolyn wasn't looking to punish, that wasn't her. She just wanted precision, closure, a room where her voice still echoed and didn't get painted over. By the end of the first week, her breathing had changed. Slower, deeper. She no longer winced when passing mirrors. She spent afternoons reading on the porch, evenings journaling by firelight, and one long, contented Sunday doing nothing but listening to the birds rearrange their choir outside. The diner sat at a bend in the road near the base of the mountain, a squat, steel-sided building that hadn't updated its menu since the Clinton administration. It smelled of warm syrup and bacon fat, and Irene was already in a booth when Carolyn arrived. "You look good," Irene said, setting down her coffee. "I feel like myself again," Carolyn replied. "That's not nothing." Irene slid a folder across the table. Everything's ready. Your portion was always the majority. With the buyout, you'll have full legal authority again. No waiting period, no arbitration. Carolyn opened her wallet and pulled out a cashier's check. Irene took it, gave it a glance, then raised an eyebrow. Where'd this come from? Richard's annuity, Carolyn said. Never touched it. He set it up when he was still teaching full-time, called it my emergency parachute. I guess I finally decided to pull the cord. Irene nodded slowly. Well, congratulations. You're about to own your home again. Cleanly. Quietly. Fully, Carolyn added. They talked through the last procedural steps: transfer filing, notification language, certified delivery. By the time the waitress dropped off the check, everything was set in motion. 2 days later, Carolyn drove into town and walked into the Asheville post office. She handed the clerk a thick manila envelope addressed in her own steady hand. Certified mail, she said, signature required. The woman nodded, stamped it carefully, and slid it into the outgoing bin. Carolyn walked out without looking back. Inside that envelope was every piece of paper Jason and Mia needed to understand what had happened: a breakdown of the buyout, the deed transfer confirmation, a letter drafted by Irene that spelled out, in calm legal terms, that their partial claim had been formally voided. The house was hers again, legally, permanently. Back at the cabin that night, Carolyn lit the fire and curled beneath the quilt. Her fingers traced the edge of her journal page as she added a single line. They redrew the rooms. I redrew the lines. Outside, a wind picked up through the trees. A cleansing kind. It rattled the branches just enough to feel like permission. Carolyn closed her eyes and let the warmth wrap around her like a shield. Tomorrow, they would receive the letter. Tomorrow, everything would begin to shift. And for the first time in a long while, she'd no longer be on the receiving end. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Jason found it first, wedged among a bundle of glossy junk mail. The return address was Irene Hayes, attorney at law. The weight of it alone gave him pause. He tore the seal open at the kitchen counter, hands still damp from rinsing dishes. Carolyn wasn't home. Still at the cabin, though he didn't know where exactly. Just that she'd taken some time. By the time Mia read the document, her jaw tightened and her eyebrows cinched so sharply it looked like her face had folded in on itself. She skimmed the cover letter once, then again, slower, then slammed the packet onto the counter. She bought us out? Without telling us? Jason paced, letter trembling in his hand. She used Dad's annuity. I thought she'd forgotten about that thing. Mia crossed her arms. This isn't legal. It can't be. It is, he said, voice hollow. We signed those partial rights forms when she moved in, remember? No joint ownership, just occupancy. It was symbolic, not symbolic anymore, she snapped. She's evicting us. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Jason opened it, expecting a neighbor or delivery. But Carolyn stood there instead, her coat zipped, hair clipped back with precision, expression as unreadable as weathered stone. He blinked. Mom, I suggest you read the packet again, she said, her voice gentle, but stripped of apology. We did, Mia said from the hallway. And I'm telling you right now, this smells like elder abuse. We'll go public with this. A vulnerable woman manipulated into signing away her home. Carolyn turned her eyes on Mia like she was a sound being turned down, then calmly reached into her bag and removed another folder. She handed it to Jason. Inside, signed documents dated 2 years back, Jason's own signature on every page, stating clearly he understood his and Mia's occupancy rights were temporary. That legal ownership still rested solely with Carolyn and could be restructured without additional consent. I'm not kicking you out, Carolyn said. I'm giving you 60 days to find what I already did. Peace. Jason's mouth opened, then closed. Mia stepped forward. You are unbelievable. We opened our home. You mean the one I still legally owned when you redecorated over my memories? Carolyn asked. When you tossed my things like they were in the way of your weekend aesthetic? Jason looked at her, voice trembling now. You blindsided us. No, she said quietly. I corrected the record. She turned and walked down the path. Not fast, not dramatic. Just done. That night, Mia took to her Instagram. A carefully framed selfie. Mascara just slightly smudged, hair tied in a messy bun, kitchen staged behind her. The caption read, "When your own mother-in-law evicts you from your home at 36. Boomer justice. Elder abuse. Family is supposed to mean something." It spread faster than she expected, but not the way she expected. By morning, the comment section had shifted. Wait, she owned the house? Girl? Sounds like you got too comfortable with someone else's property. Respect goes both ways. Don't bite the hand that paid the mortgage. Boomer mom or boundaries boss? Even people Mia had known for years left quiet likes on the more supportive comments. Jason scrolled through them in silence, the glow of the screen making his face look older somehow. Hollowed. He didn't speak. Just stood near the window, watching the rain begin to gather at the edges of the porch. Carolyn, miles away, sat by the cabin fireplace, sipping black tea. Her phone buzzed once. She saw the tag from Mia's post, clicked through, and read exactly 5 comments before turning the screen off again. She didn't need to scroll further. The reaction spoke louder than any defense she could mount. They were learning, at last, what she'd already known. Sometimes kindness becomes the rope people use to pull you under. And sometimes reclaiming your space means letting others learn how to swim. Outside the cabin, the rain turned steady. Cleansing. She picked up her pen, opened her notebook, and wrote just 2 words. Phase 3. The house was quiet when she stepped through the door. Not the stiff kind of quiet she'd grown used to over the past few months, the strained hush after Mia's passive sighs or Jason's clipped responses. No, this quiet was different, spacious, honest, like the walls had finally exhaled. Carolyn shut the door behind her and paused in the foyer. The filtered afternoon light from the kitchen skylight glinted off the floorboards, and dust motes hung gently in the still air. Jason and Mia had left that morning for a weekend getaway, Mia's idea of resetting the energy. Carolyn had smiled when she heard them packing, said nothing when they walked out. She just waited until the car was out of sight, then came back. Her house, her timing. She began in the living room. Notebook in hand, she moved slowly, scanning each wall, shelf, and surface. The coffee table had a scratch that hadn't been there before, pen tip deep as though someone had dragged something sharp in irritation. She noted it. A post-it fluttered from the bookshelf. These books are just clutter. Her books. She flipped the yellow square into the trash and gently pulled her first editions back into a box labeled Keep, Owner, Property. In the dining room, one of her mother's china dishes had been pushed to the back of the sideboard. She examined it for chips, found none, and wrapped it carefully in linen. A set of heirloom silver spoons, once polished and placed with reverence, now sat in a Ziploc bag beneath some extra placemats. She moved upstairs. Jason's old room still smelled faintly of dust and aftershave. She stood in the doorway for a beat, her eyes softening. Posters from his high school years had long since been replaced by Mia's idea of neutral tones. Beige drapes, a desk no one used, and a half-burned candle that smelled like artificial lavender. In the closet, tucked behind a box of tangled cords and a yoga wheel, she found it, Jason's old baseball glove, faded, worn smooth at the palm, initials faint but still visible in blue marker. She held it in both hands, her breath caught, just once. Not a sob, not a breakdown, just a pause, a muscle memory. There had been a time when he ran through this house barefoot, glove in hand, asking her to pitch just one more. She placed it in a separate box. No label. In her room, once hers, now referred to only as the guest suite, she found more signs of erasure. A note had been taped to the top drawer of her dresser in bold black Sharpie. "We're not living in a museum, Mom." Carolyn stared at it for a long time, then peeled it off slowly, folded it into quarters, and placed it in the trash without a word. She opened the drawer and found her pearl earrings tucked behind a stack of paper napkins. A crystal frame, one Richard had given her on their 25th anniversary, was upside down in a bottom cabinet drawer beneath a pile of battery packs. Item by item, she gathered what was hers. Once she'd finished, she walked through the house again, barefoot this time, the floors cool, her steps even. In the hallway, she stood in front of the linen closet and opened it slowly. Inside was a mix of their things and hers. Towels she hadn't bought, sheets in patterns she never chose. She took what belonged to her. Everything else she boxed, sealed with duct tape and labeled clearly in firm uppercase letters, M's property, return or toss. By the time the sun began its descent behind the hills, Carolyn had moved each of her boxes into the garage, stacking them neatly in a corner she once used for gardening tools. Then she made one last call. "Locksmith?" she said, voice even. "I'd like to schedule a rekey for a residential property. Yes, I'm the owner." She gave the address. "Tomorrow morning, please. Earliest appointment." She ended the call, slid her phone into her pocket, and walked outside to the porch. The air was turning cooler, the birds quieter. She sat in her chair, her actual chair, and looked out across the yard. She had done it. Not loud, not cruel, but completely. And tomorrow, when the locksmith arrived, the locks would change. And with them, so would everything else. The envelope came by certified mail, though Carolyn had already known it was on its way. Still, when she slid her letter opener beneath the flap and unfolded the final deed, her breath held for just a second longer than she expected. Her name. Only her name. Carolyn Marie Marks. No co-owners, no partial rights, no parentheses or footnotes. The document was clean, legally bound, county-stamped, and final. The weight of it sat quietly in her lap like a truth that no longer needed to be defended. She exhaled through her nose and placed the papers back into their folder. Then tucked that folder into a new fireproof box, freshly purchased from the hardware store, labeled in her own tidy handwriting, Legacy, finalized. By early afternoon, Irene arrived, hair swept into its usual low twist, briefcase in one hand, a glass jar of blackberry preserves in the other. "I brought this," she said, holding up the jar, "so I wouldn't show up empty-handed, but I'm also not leaving with it, so you'd better have toast." Carolyn smiled and ushered her inside, where the kettle was already beginning to hiss. By 3 o'clock, there were 4 women around the dining room table, each one with a teacup in hand and a linen napkin folded on her lap. Irene, Marlene from next door, Doris, who had once helped Carolyn during her recovery, and Beverly, the retired, who still insisted on mailing handwritten thank you notes. They didn't toast. They didn't clink glasses or give speeches. But there was a pause when the scones were passed, a kind of reverent silence before laughter began to thread through the room. No one brought up Jason or Mia. No one needed to. Later that week, a letter arrived, handwritten, slanted cursive in blue ink, from the clerk's desk at the local courthouse. Case dismissed. Mia Talbot vs. Carolyn Marks, filed under emotional distress, denied under insufficient merit. Carolyn read it once, folded it, and placed it in her shred pile. She didn't flinch. That night, she opened the binder where her estate documents lived and pulled out her will. She uncapped her pen. With steady strokes, she drew a firm line through Jason's name. Then, beneath the revised clause, she wrote in clean, unshakable ink, "Presence during need is Legacy's only price." She capped the pen, folded the will, replaced it. The next morning, she made a quiet call to St. Margaret's Community Center. She'd volunteered there once before her heart scare. "I'm not sure what help I can be," she said into the phone, "but I'm available." The coordinator sounded delighted. "We've just reopened the intergenerational mentorship program. Think you'd be up for meeting some seniors who've recently relocated to Asheville? I think I'd be up for remembering what generosity looks like when it has boundaries." "Well," the woman said with a laugh, "we don't have a checkbox for that, but I'll mark you down for Thursday." That evening, her doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't paperwork, just neighbors. Marlene's daughter dropped off lemon bars. Doris brought snickerdoodles. Someone even left a small plant with a tag that read, "For your new beginning." Carolyn set them on the counter, warmed by the way word had traveled, not like gossip, but like validation. A quiet chorus behind her that said, "You were right to take it back." And still, there was one more envelope. This one she didn't open right away. She took it to the study, lit a single lamp, and held it in her hands for a long while. Then she slit the seal and pulled out the deed to a different property. A modest 2-bedroom house across town. She'd bought it in cash through a trust Irene helped her build. There was no announcement, no ribbon cutting, just a signature. Carolyn filed the transfer papers into a folder labeled, "To be donated, Elder Housing Trust. Not yet, but soon." And no one would know it came from her. Only that a place existed because someone believed space could be sacred again. She closed the drawer, locked it. Outside, dusk softened the yard into shadows. A wind picked up, and from somewhere beyond the porch, the sound of children playing carried faintly in the breeze. She leaned back in her chair, let the weight of the day settle. One house reclaimed, one house waiting, and a future that no longer asked her to shrink inside of it. The text came just before noon. "Jason, Mia thought maybe we could do dinner, just talk things through, for closure. No pressure." Carolyn stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down beside her mug. The word closure rang hollow, like a door being shut from the wrong side, but she responded with one word anyway. "Sure." That evening she wore gray slacks and a pale blue cardigan, nothing too formal, nothing that could be mistaken for ceremony. She brought no bag, no documents, only what she planned to leave behind. The table was set when she arrived. Cloth napkins, lit candles, even the good silverware, hers technically. A casserole dish bubbled faintly in the oven. Mia hovered by the counter, flipping the roasted vegetables. Jason poured wine like a man who hoped it could drown tension before it rose again. "Mom," he said with a nervous smile, "thanks for coming." "Of course," she replied. Her voice was calm, as always, just a touch quieter than usual. They ate slowly. Mia asked questions about the community center. Jason complimented the lemon bars someone had dropped off earlier that week. Everything was pleasant, polite, as if the last 6 months had been a brief misunderstanding instead of a slow demolition. "So," Mia said after the plates had been cleared, wine nearly gone, "we were wondering—" Carolyn's fork rested neatly beside her plate. "If you'd considered, now that things have calmed, maybe reversing some of the changes? With the deed? The ownership?" Jason cleared his throat. "What Mia means is, things got heated, and we didn't handle it well. We just thought, maybe, we could come to something fair. For all of us." Carolyn looked from one face to the other. Their expressions were carefully curated, regret-shaped, but she could tell the words had been practiced, rehearsed more than felt. "I see," she said softly. "You're asking if I'll undo what you assumed I'd never do in the first place." Jason flinched slightly. Mia didn't blink. Carolyn reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. She placed it in the center of the table, untouched by candlelight or guilt. Jason stared at it. "What is that?" Mia asked. 30-day notice, Carolyn said, folding her hands. "Per local ordinance. I'm giving you a formal timeline to vacate." Mia's chair scraped hard against the floor as she stood. "You're unbelievable," she said, eyes wild. "We offer an olive branch and you throw paperwork in our faces?" Carolyn remained seated, still, rooted. "This is my olive branch," she said. "You get 30 days, legal, clear, painless. You could have had much less." Jason leaned forward, voice low and desperate. "It's still our home too. I grew up here." "Yes," she said. "You did. And then you grew up and turned my bedroom into a guest suite. Let your wife erase your father's photos, tossed my things like they were clutter." Jason's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He just sat back, shoulders folding inward. Carolyn rose. She picked up her coat slowly, slid one arm in, then the other. She paused as she reached the doorway. "You asked for closure," she said. "Closure requires an ending. I'm offering one." Mia stood frozen near the counter. Jason opened his mouth again, but no words came. Carolyn gave the room one last look, not sentimental, not angry, just finished. She hugged no one. She walked to the door, opened it, and let the cold night air slip in around her. Behind her, the silence fractured into a whimper, either Jason's or Mia's. She wasn't sure. She didn't turn to check. As she stepped onto the porch, her breath curled in the air. The wind shifted, catching in the trees like applause. She walked toward her car, coat buttoned tight against the chill, headlights blinking in the distance. Back inside, the envelope remained on the table. Unopened, but undeniable. The listing appeared on a Tuesday morning, quietly, almost sheepishly, buried between a new duplex build in West Asheville and a fixer-upper on the south end of town. But Carolyn's house was unmistakable. The gabled roofline, the lilac bushes, the porch swing that hadn't belonged to anyone but her. The description was bland and eager. Charming three-bedroom family home with potential for modern updates, motivated sellers, serious inquiries only. She read the copy twice, then checked the contact. Not Mia, not Jason. A real estate agent she'd never met. Local, young, probably looped in by someone playing games with borrowed authority. Later that afternoon, the agent herself called. "Hi, Mrs. Marks. I just wanted to verify some basic listing details before we finalize the open house." "Listing?" Carolyn asked gently. A pause, then some verbal shuffling. "Yes, the property at 122 Briar Ridge. Your son indicated there was shared ownership and—" "There isn't," Carolyn said, her tone even. "But go ahead and let it run." The woman hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "You will." She ended the call before clarification could bleed into apology. By Saturday, there were folding signs staked into the yard, freshly printed brochures tucked inside the fence gate. Carolyn watched from her parked car half a block away, the brim of her sun hat tipped just low enough to shield her eyes. Cars began to pull into the drive by noon, a couple with two toddlers, a man in hiking boots with a camera around his neck, someone in a Range Rover who looked deeply unimpressed before even opening the door. She waited until the fifth group entered before she stepped out. Her heels clicked softly against the sidewalk as she approached the house. Inside, Jason stood near the fireplace, gesturing vaguely at the vaulted ceilings as though he'd installed them himself. Mia trailed behind, attempting cheer with a pitchy, unconvincing cadence. "We've loved this house, really. So many memories here." Carolyn opened the door and walked in. Everything stopped. The chatter stuttered. One of the toddlers pointed at her and whispered, "That's the lady from the picture." Mia's face went slack. Jason dropped his brochure. The realtor, red-haired, blazer too tight, turned a shade paler. "I believe," Carolyn said calmly, "we've got a situation involving false representation of a deeded property." The room froze. Jason stepped forward. "Mom, don't," she said. To the realtor she added, "Did my son mention that he was not, in fact, the legal owner?" "No, he said there was some kind of shared—" "There isn't. There hasn't been for months." The woman looked between them, jaw clenched. "We'll need to pull the listing immediately. I could lose my license over this." "I'd say you should," Carolyn replied, "but I'm in a forgiving mood today." She turned to Jason and pulled a folded paper from her bag. No envelope. Just the raw document, crisp and final. "Cease and desist," she said. "This covers unauthorized representation, fraudulent marketing, and miscommunication of property rights. If I file it, the sheriff will be here before you can stage the guest." "Bathroom?" Jason didn't take the paper. She laid it gently on the mantel, right where their family photos used to live. The guests, stunned into silence, began to trickle out. Awkward nods, muted apologies. No one made eye contact, not even the toddlers. Mia whispered something to Jason, then disappeared down the hall. The realtor followed close behind, phone already out, muttering legal jargon to someone on the other end of the line. Carolyn stayed a moment longer. Jason stood still, arms crossed over his chest like a teenager about to be grounded. "It's really over," he said. "It was over the moment you mistook access for entitlement," she replied. He nodded. "Just once." Not in agreement, more in exhaustion or understanding. She walked past him, out the door, down the porch steps. The sign in the yard had already begun to tilt in the wind. She pulled it up and leaned it against the fence. Before she got into her car, she looked back just once. The curtains had parted slightly. Someone, Mia, was watching her from the hallway. Carolyn didn't wave. She didn't have to. The wind was enough, and the mantle now held only one thing, her signature. Carolyn began in the smallest room, the laundry nook tucked between the pantry and the back door. The wallpaper had peeled at the edges, faded from years of heat and steam, its dainty tulip print barely clinging to the drywall. She didn't rush, just stood for a while with a mug of tea, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching the morning light shift across the tiles. Then she peeled the first strip. By midday, the wallpaper was gone. By the end of the week, the nook had been painted a soft moss green, chosen not for trend but for memory. Richard had once said it was the color of her eyes when she was angry and focused. The rest followed, piece by piece. In the front hallway, she rehung the framed needlepoint her mother had stitched in '78. In the den, she placed her hardcover books back on the shelves Jason had once labeled too crowded. A small blue vase, cracked but precious, returned to the fireplace mantel. The rooms didn't just change, they exhaled. They uncurled, like flowers relieved of frost. She worked quietly, letting each day hold only as much as it needed to. Some rooms waited longer, others came alive more quickly. Her house, her rhythm. A week later, the volunteers from the Elder Housing Group arrived, 2 men and a woman, all graying but energetic, paint-splattered sneakers and laughter that echoed like spring. They helped her repaint the guest room, now her study, in warm amber tones. The woman, Darlene, whistled while she cut edges with painter's tape. "Feels like the kind of place where people finally listen to themselves," she said, brushing a smooth stroke along the baseboard. Carolyn smiled. That's the goal. They left her with a casserole, a thank you card, and a standing offer to help with the garden once April came. The next morning, Carolyn opened the front door and found a small bundle of forwarded mail on the porch. No knock, no doorbell. Mia had dropped it off. Carolyn saw the familiar cursive on the post-it stuck to the top envelope. Mail from last week. Didn't want it to get lost. No apology, no warmth, just acknowledgement. She stepped outside and glanced down the street. Mia was already backing out of the driveway, eyes forward, mouth tight. Their gazes didn't meet. Carolyn raised her hand in a small, neutral wave, not beckoning, not dismissing, just seeing. Mia didn't wave back. Carolyn brought the mail inside and set it on the counter. Bills, a gardening catalog, and a single envelope with no return address. She opened it last. Inside, an email printed out. From Jason. Subject, "Can we talk?" Body, "I know we've both said our piece, but I still feel like there's something left. If you ever want to talk, no agenda, no angles, just tell me when." She read it twice, then turned to her laptop. Her fingers hovered for only a moment before she typed. Reply, "You had months to talk. I had 1 moment to act. We're even." She hit send. Then she shut the laptop gently, walked into the living room, and selected a vinyl from her collection, the one Richard used to play Sunday evenings, soft jazz, no lyrics, just the mellow hush of saxophone and upright bass. The needle dropped with a quiet crackle. She sat back in her armchair, the one Jason had once moved to the garage, and let the music fill the space between walls that now remembered her name. Outside, the wind stirred the chimes on the back porch. She didn't need applause, or forgiveness, or closure. She had something rarer, control, and the luxury of deciding when and if she'd ever let either of them in again. The headline appeared below the fold in the Sunday edition of the Asheville Sentinel, "A House Reclaimed When Legal Rights Become Personal Boundaries." Carolyn nearly didn't see it at first. She'd spread the paper across her kitchen table the way she always did, sections in neat stacks, crossword, clipped out for later, coffee steaming gently beside her favorite mug. It wasn't until the feature page fell open with a soft rustle that she saw the photo. It was her front porch, the swing, The chimes, the newly repainted door, still catching morning light like it had something to say. The article didn't name Jason or Mia, not once. The journalist, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s named Lee, had insisted on discretion. What mattered, she'd said during the interview, wasn't who Carolyn had pushed out. It was what she'd protected. The piece was measured, elegant. Carolyn's words had been recorded exactly as she'd spoken them. Control isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's a quiet form of survival. By noon, her inbox was full. Strangers, neighbors, 2 women from her old church, a former client from Richard's tutoring days. Even an email from a young man in Oregon who wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to reclaim my father's workshop. I didn't realize you were allowed to take back things people borrowed like they owned them." The comments online mirrored the tone. Grateful, moved, resonant. Carolyn replied only to a few. The ones that asked for nothing but offered something. Reflection, solidarity, the kind of warmth that didn't ask for access. That same afternoon, Irene forwarded a voicemail from a law professor in Boston. A firm voice, New England cadence clipped and practiced. "I'd like to request permission to use Ms. Marks's case in an estate law training module. The way she enacted a reverse claim, while maintaining ethical distance, is a textbook in proactive boundary setting. But more than that, it's instructive, especially for women clients navigating inheritance gray zones." Carolyn replied with a single condition: use it. But not as a tale of pity. "I never lost control. I waited. Precision only." Irene texted back a thumbs-up emoji and a gif of a sword being unsheathed. Later that evening, Carolyn sat at her desk and clipped the newspaper article into a large envelope. She added a sticky note, pale yellow, her writing sharp and unmistakable. "Legacy is earned, not inherited." She sealed it and addressed it to Jason's office, not their house. He'd understand that difference. As she walked to the mailbox under the slow bloom of dusk, she saw Darlene from the housing center drive past in her old minivan. She honked once and waved. Carolyn waved back, the kind that didn't stop at the wrist. Generous, unguarded. She had nearly turned to go inside when she noticed the other envelope. Thin, cream-colored, hand-addressed, but not in Jason's or Mia's hand. No return label. She opened it there on the porch, the paper still warm from the afternoon sun. Inside was a single page, typed cleanly. "Dear Mrs. Marks, I read your story in the Sentinel. I recognized the porch instantly. I used to sit on it, years ago, when your husband and I would go over research papers between semesters. I was one of Richard's colleagues at the community college. He spoke of you often, with respect and a kind of reverence you don't see much anymore. I'm now a trustee of a small philanthropic fund aimed at creating intergenerational spaces. If you'd ever consider turning your home or part of it into a quiet retreat for women navigating transition, I'd be honored to discuss terms. No pressure, just possibility. Respectfully, James Ellery Asheville Humanities Grant Consortium." Carolyn read the letter twice. Then again. She folded it neatly, brought it inside, and placed it beside her tea kettle. She didn't move for a while, just stood in the center of the kitchen, fingers brushing lightly against the countertop, as if steadying herself for a different kind of wind, not one that threatened, but one that invited. Outside, the air thickened with the smell of early honeysuckle. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed with its windows down, music trailing behind like a lost ribbon. Carolyn picked up the letter again, tracing the embossed seal at the bottom. Not yet, but maybe. Maybe the house had one more story to offer, one that wasn't about reclaiming the past, but about shaping the future. The sun hadn't yet crested the edge of the hills when Carolyn sat at the dining table, papers spread before her like a quiet ceremony. The same table where Jason once accused her of betrayal. The same place Mia had asked her to reconsider. Now it held only one question. Was she ready to let go? And still remain? The ink was dark, final. The pen smooth and deliberate in her fingers. The transfer wasn't a sale. It wasn't even a surrender. It was a transformation. The house would become part of the Asheville Elderscape Trust, a pilot program for community-supported transitional housing for aging women. She'd remain as resident steward, not owner, not tenant, something between permanence and passing. She signed on page 3, then again on page 5, then twice more at the end, initials tucked into corners like quiet signatures on a quilt. When she finished, component placement, she looked up and saw the light touch the corner of the living room. It landed on the old photo of her and Richard, newly reframed beside a snapshot of the volunteers laughing mid-paint stroke. The doorbell rang just before 10. Carolyn opened it to find a woman in her early 70s, trim, nervous, and dressed in a cardigan far too thin for the chill. "Mrs. Marks?" she asked. "Call me Carolyn," she replied, stepping aside. The woman introduced herself as Joan, a retired middle school teacher whose rent had recently doubled after her apartment building was sold. "I never thought I'd be in this position," she said, voice low with embarrassment. "Neither did I," Carolyn said gently, leading her inside. "But look where we are." Joan moved slowly through the house, eyes pausing on each room like she was looking for memories she hadn't made yet. Carolyn had prepared the back bedroom, fresh sheets, a pitcher of water, a small vase of rosemary by the windowsill. That night they ate lentil stew at the kitchen island, quietly at first. But soon, Joan was telling stories about students who'd mailed her graduation photos, and Carolyn was laughing in a way she hadn't since her first week at the cabin. By Thursday, 2 more women had arrived, both from wait lists that rarely moved. Carolyn didn't ask how they'd heard. It didn't matter. The house had begun whispering again, not as protest, as welcome. On Sunday, she opened the kitchen for a community meal. A few from the center came. One of the volunteers brought her teenage granddaughter. Joan made a pie. Carolyn made a list of names on a folded paper towel so she wouldn't forget anyone the next time they came. The walls, once bare and blank for Mia's aesthetic, now held a patchwork of faces. Doris from next door, Darlene mid-laugh, Joan standing beneath the dogwood tree, squinting into the sun. Even one of Richard, teaching at the chalkboard, donated by James Ellery after digging it out from an old departmental archive. That night, after the dishes were done and the last guest had left, Carolyn sat at her desk and opened her journal. She wrote, without pause, "This is what homes are for." Then she slipped the signed trust papers into a folder and sealed it. She addressed it to Irene, with a note clipped on top, "Closure file, retain, but no response needed." And finally, before turning in, she pulled out one last note card, a thick white square, blank on one side. On the other, she wrote, "Forgiveness is not required. Peace is." She left it on her nightstand, beneath her reading glasses. Outside, wind stirred the trees again, but not like it had months ago. No longer cleansing. Now it simply circled, as if the house itself was breathing, and she, finally, was letting it speak. It was late morning when Carolyn finally opened the lockbox. She'd moved it from closet to closet over the years, through renovations, grief, and guest room rebranding. It had always felt too heavy to deal with and too sacred to discard. But now, with sunlight pooling through the kitchen window and quiet footfalls of the new residents upstairs, the moment had come. She sat on the living room floor with the box in her lap, an old metal thing dented at the corner, the kind with a clasp that stuck unless you coaxed it just right. It took a minute. Then the lid gave. Inside, time. Folded, creased, and yellowed at the edges. The first thing she pulled out was a pale blue envelope with a tiny ink smudge near the corner. She opened it slowly. Her first paycheck stub. 1973. Bookstore clerk, $63.88. Next to it, tucked in a worn napkin from a diner long since torn down, was a letter in Richard's handwriting. "You make the house feel like it has a heartbeat. I'll follow it anywhere." Carolyn's fingers paused there, not trembling, just still, as if motion might disturb the echo. She read it once, then again, then tucked it under her knee. Beneath that, in the bottom of the box, was a smaller note. Handwritten, short. Probably something Richard had left for her in one of those early years when life was full of student loans and stubborn plumbing and dreams that hadn't quite figured out where to land. Keep your space sacred, even from the ones you love, especially then. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in weeks, not since Joan's first pie and the sound of someone humming down the hallway. But she did close her eyes for a moment, let the weight of it settle like warmth in her chest. Later that day, she placed the note on the mantel, right where the false listing brochure had once landed. This time, the paper stayed. By spring, the house was more than a house, 60% full. 4 women now called it home. Joan, a former nurse named Grace, an artist named Yvonne, and a recently widowed librarian who hadn't spoken much but smiled often. They shared dinners, chores, recipes, and once on a rainy Thursday, a full bottle of wine and 3 playlists from the 80s. The neighborhood had begun referring to it simply as the reclaimed home. A local middle school teacher requested a tour for their 7th grade history unit. On spaces, she explained over the phone, and the different ways we define home. Carolyn agreed. She printed out laminated quotes from residents, added framed photos along the main hallway, labeled the kitchen commons and the dining room conversations. When the kids came, they asked everything from, "Do you have Wi-Fi?" to, "Why did the house need reclaiming?" Carolyn answered every question. Patient, steady, honest. She showed them the old garden gate that Jason once broke and never fixed, now painted robin's egg blue and holding fast. That Sunday, she hosted poetry again. 3 folding chairs turned into 6. Someone brought a guitar. Carolyn read a few lines from a Mary Oliver piece and then one of her own. The house didn't need silence anymore to feel peaceful. It had earned the right to hold sound. That afternoon, a bouquet arrived. White roses, expensive ones. No note, no sender. The florist had Jason's name on the order slip. Carolyn didn't flinch, just clipped the blooms short, stripped the leaves, and walked them out to the compost bin. She watched them land among coffee grounds and onion skins, then returned to the garden, where mint and lavender were beginning to push through the thaw. She knelt and cleared the soil around the thyme. The air smelled of loam and something sweet beneath it, maybe apple blossoms, maybe memory. She wasn't lonely. She was alone, yes, but in the way a tree stands alone, rooted, reaching. In the window behind her, the lockbox sat open still, its lid gently swaying in the breeze from the cracked pane. Not forgotten, just done. The county recorder's office was quiet, the way government buildings tend to be on warm weekdays, fluorescent lights humming low, linoleum worn smooth by decades of appointments, divorces, and deeds. Carolyn stepped to the counter, folder in hand, scarf tucked gently around her neck. The clerk, young, polite, a little flushed from the heat, scanned her ID, typed something, and turned the screen slightly toward her. "There it is," he said, tapping once. Carolyn leaned forward. "Marks, Carolyn Marie sole owner. Recorded 2025, no co-ownership, no conditional rights." There it was, not a victory, not a banner. Just a fact, uncomplicated, unchallenged, and legally hers. She smiled. Not triumphantly, but completely. Before she left, she handed the clerk a sealed folder marked Reference Copy, Discretionary Use. Inside, annotated deed templates, excerpts from estate law cases, and a handwritten note clipped to the front. "If another woman ever walks in here unsure whether she's allowed to say no, show her this first." She walked out into late spring light, the sun slanting across Main Street in golden sheets. Wind stirred faintly along the sidewalk. She didn't feel younger or lighter. She just felt clear. That afternoon, she met James Ellery at the edge of the backyard, near the old fence where ivy used to choke the posts. He brought contracts. She brought lemonade. "I thought maybe just the west lot," she said. "Enough for 12 beds and a few benches. Nothing too fussy." James nodded. "Community garden? For anyone who needs to put something back in the ground after having it pulled out." He signed. She initialed. By the end of the hour, 1/3 of the land had been formally donated to the Elderscape Outreach Plot Initiative. In the weeks that followed, volunteers arrived with shovels and lumber. Neighbors dropped off tomato seedlings and seed packets labeled in looping cursive. The soil, once stamped flat from years of parked cars and forgotten holiday decorations, grew soft again. By June, there were bell peppers coming up beside basil. Someone planted sunflowers along the back gate. Carolyn named them after women she admired: Audrey, Eleanor, Dolores. One Saturday, she sat on the porch with Joan and Yvonne, watching two girls from the neighborhood play tag between the raised beds. "This place used to be hard," Joan said quietly. Carolyn didn't disagree. "Now it's just honest." Inside, the kitchen buzzed faintly with music. Darlene was frosting a cake. The scent of cardamom and brown sugar floated to the porch in warm pulses. Carolyn tilted her head, catching the sound of laughter spilling from the hallway where Grace was showing a new resident how to open the antique window latches. The house, once war-torn, now held layers. Not paint, not decor. Something less visible, more permanent. That night, alone in her room, Carolyn opened her journal. Not the daily one, the other. The one she kept tucked between novels on her bookshelf, spine cracked, pages stitched back together with tape and resolve. She turned to the final page and wrote in a steady hand, "Everything went wrong after I moved in. Then I moved out and took their access with me." She paused, then underlined one word: access. Not love, not connection, just the assumed, unearned entitlement to her time, her name, her rooms. She capped the pen, smoothed the page, and slid the journal into its cloth sleeve. Outside, porch lights twinkled soft against the evening. She walked barefoot to the front step, where she could hear the last of the garden laughter trailing off into the dusk. A screen door clicked. A cicada whined. Someone inside asked if there was more cake. Carolyn didn't answer. She just sat, not in reflection, not in mourning, but in stillness. Her name no longer needed to echo through the house. It was etched, where it belonged, and this time no one would paint over it.